Hey everyone! So today we're diving into the pretty wild evolution of management thinking. It's a story that goes from this intense search for one single perfect formula for success to the modern idea that, the best managers don't have a magic wand. Nope. They've got a really well-stocked toolbox. And the only right answer to most questions? It's almost always, it depends. And really, it all starts with this one question. Over a century, this is what drove management theory. And way back when, the assumption was a big, confident yes. The only challenge was, finding that perfect blueprint, that one-size-fits-all plan that you could just stamp onto any company to make it run like a well-oiled machine. But is it really ever that simple? And that leads us right into our first era, this quest for the one best way. This was the age of classical management, a time when efficiency was absolutely king, and organizations were seen as these giant, predictable engines. Yeah. This whole scientific management idea was all about breaking every single job down into its tiniest little pieces to find the one single most efficient way to do it. And look, it worked. It created some incredible efficiency. But the side effect? It also created incredibly rigid organizations that just couldn't handle change. They just freeze up. So seeing the limits of that machine-like view led to a massive, massive breakthrough. People started to see organizations not as engines, but as these complex, living systems, way more like an organism than a machine. And this, right here, was the birth of what we call the systems approach. And this was a huge shift in thinking. The old way, reductionism, was all about taking the engine apart to see how each little gear worked on its own. The new way, holism, said, no, you can only understand the whole system by seeing how all the parts work together. Suddenly, the interactions between the parts became the most important thing to look at.
Okay, and this brings up another really key distinction. An entire organization, that's an open system. It absolutely has to interact with the outside world, taking in resources, money, people, ideas, just to survive. Now, sure, maybe some departments inside, like accounting, might operate as more of a closed system, but the business itself, it's constantly in a give and take with its environment.
So if a company is a system, what are its main parts? Well, theorists boiled it down to 4 key interconnected variables. And you can remember them with the acronym POET: the people, the organizational structure, the external environment, and the technology. And what they realized was you couldn't just change one, say, introduce a new technology, without it causing this huge ripple effect through all the others. And think about it. If an organization is this complex, open system where everything is connected, then the whole idea of a single best way to manage just completely falls apart, right? It just doesn't make sense. And that logical next step gave us the next major evolution, contingency theory. Its simple but really profound answer to almost every management question is, you guessed it depends. And some of the early research shows this perfectly. It turns out that in a really stable, predictable industry, a rigid, mechanistic structure with a clear chain of command works great. But if you're in a fast-changing, chaotic environment, you need an organic structure, something flexible, decentralized, that can adapt on the fly. In other words, the best way to structure your company is contingent on your environment. This led to another really fascinating question. Okay, so we've seen how the outside world matters, but what about a company's internal technology? Does the way a company actually makes its stuff influence how it should be managed? This is the exact question that a researcher named Joan Woodward set out to answer. So Woodward and her team went out and studied about 100 different manufacturing firms. First, they just sorted them based on their core production technology, and they came up with these 3 main buckets. You had your one-off custom jobs, your classic assembly lines, and then your continuous flow processes, like what you'd see in an oil refinery. And what they found was absolutely groundbreaking. Woodward discovered that the most successful companies were the ones where the structure and management style actually matched their technology. The mass production companies, they did best with those flat, mechanistic structures, just like the old theories would have predicted. But the companies at the extremes, doing custom work or continuous processing, they were most successful with taller, more organic, flexible structures. The takeaway was huge. Technology dictates the best way to manage. Now, other researchers came along and added another layer to this. They argued that success really depends on balancing 2 opposing forces. First, you have differentiation. That's how you specialize and divide up all the work into different departments.
But then you need integration, which is all about how you get those different departments to actually work together and collaborate. And the right balance between the two? Well, once again, it's contingent on the demands of the environment. Okay, so up to this point, whenever we've said technology, we've mostly been talking about manufacturing hardware, right? But then in the second half of the 20th century, a whole new kind of technology started to completely reshape the entire management puzzle: information systems. And this brings us to this really important concept of socio-technical systems. The big idea here is that you just can't treat your people and your technology as two separate things. The social system, the people, the culture, the teams, and the technical system are deeply, deeply intertwined. To get the best performance, you have to design them so they work together seamlessly, right from the start. And just look at how fast this all happened. From these early theoretical ideas in the mid-century to the absolute explosion of personal computers and networks in the 70s and 80s. And then, boom, the internet era. Technology wasn't just a tool anymore. It was literally becoming the central nervous system of the entire organization. And this highlights a really critical point. These systems aren't valuable just because they can handle a ton of data, raw, unorganized facts and figures. They're valuable because they turn that data into information, something that's been processed, that's meaningful, and that you can actually use to make better decisions. That transformation from data to information, that's the whole ballgame. So how does all this tech change a manager's actual job? Well, one modern model from Henry Mintzberg puts the manager right at the center, juggling three things at once: managing with information, so monitoring performance and sharing knowledge; managing through people, which is all about coaching and building culture; and then taking direct action to get things done. So this all brings us to today. We've gone on this journey from searching for simple, universal rules to navigating this really complex world of interconnected systems. But what does that really mean for the role of management now, and for the technology it relies on? I think this quote just sums it up perfectly. By the 1980s, everybody realized that these information systems weren't just for accounting or keeping track of inventory anymore. No way. Companies figured out they could use IT to fundamentally change their business, create entirely new products, and gain a massive, massive advantage over their competitors. So if there's one big takeaway from all this, it's this. The story of management is a journey away from simplicity and toward embracing complexity. There is no one best way. Instead, the modern manager needs a whole toolbox full of these complex situational frameworks: systems theory, contingency theory, socio-technical models, and more importantly, the wisdom to know which tool to use in which situation. And that brings us right to our final thought, because this story is far from over. As artificial intelligence gets woven into every part of a business, how is that going to change those POET variables we talked about? The people, the organizations, the environment, the technology. I mean, what does management even look like when your most valuable team member might not be human? What do you think is the next chapter in this story?